For some of you, this is a blast from the past. Nothing strange. All right, go ahead, the floor is yours.
Hi, you guys. Thank you for coming. I'm Caroline. I'm Liz.
And I'm Marta.
And we are the 3 coordinators for Women in Business Madrid this year. So this is our first event. Thank you guys so much for being here. I know it's the first week of school and everything. So the little sign-in sheet is getting passed around. That's just so that we can check you guys in on campus groups so that it seems like people showed up to the event. But Ibrahim is one of Women in Businesses and IE's favorite speakers of all time. So we are very lucky to have him today, and especially for such a relevant topic. If you guys have any questions or concerns for women in business, or whatever it may be, you can definitely just pull the aside and ask us anything. Without further ado, thank you guys.
Thank you all for coming, particularly, we have such new nice headquarters in the tower, but for all of you who made the trek here, I appreciate it. Let me just say hi to the Zoomers. Isa, I see you. Isa, who was the first to ever bring me to one of these events.
Hello, sorry, I'm doing some multitasking, so I can't have my video on. I don't want to distract.
No worries, just a shout out to Isa, who was the first to kind of initiate these. Candela, Oyana, I see you. See some, okay, so I just wanted to say hi to some of my, hi, Lilia. Ah, she's separated from you. What's the world coming to? Okay, anyway. So a lot of familiar faces, but for some of you, it might be the first time you're entering the talk I'm giving, which is really essentially dealing with my theories on patriarchy. So some of you might be hearing this word for the first time, or at least my definition of patriarchy for the first time. So let's review. Women in Business has had me here for 3 years. And this is a subject that there will always, hi, Maria.
Hello. Can I come?
Ah, come on, of course. You can't start without you. Thank you. No worries. Whether I'm talking about the aftermath of the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg or the Taliban, what unites this subject is patriarchy is a system. Now, how do I define the system? It's this, rather than giving you the definition of patriarchy as an abstract noun, what I try to do is to get you to think of patriarchy as a verb, you see. I argue it's almost a form of patriarchy that we do not use the word patriarchy as a verb. Why is it important to use patriarchy as a verb? It makes you focus on who is doing the patriarchy. See why it's important to use it as a verb? Because the minute we use it as that, we focus on the active agent who is doing the patriarchy. And I divide this into a system of levels. Usually religion is used as a source of patriarchy. But religion in and of itself cannot patriarchy. Religion is a set of ideas codified in a holy book. Usually it has to be priests who patriarch. But you see, this is the interesting thing here. Priests can be patriarchal, and believe me, many are. Okay. But in this case, you see, it's not really Muslim preachers who lead prayers on Friday forcing women to do this, or have the power to force women to do this. Hey, how's it going? Good to see you, another familiar face. Patriarchy can occur on a religious level. Many religious leaders are patriarchal, if we talk about all the religious systems, which is then good to distinguish. Really, then the next agent that patriarchs is the state and politicians. And it's important to realize this. We assume this is Islam being patriarching women here. I'm arguing no, it's the Afghan state being ruled by the Taliban. Why is it important to focus on the role the state plays in patriarchy? Because then once we look at the state as a level, as an actor on its own level, we understand something in common. What's happening in Afghanistan or what's happening in Texas. Then you see the connection, you see. And that's why it's always important to use patriarchy as a word. Because in both cases, then it's the state that's patriarchy. And in both cases, it's the state usually comprised of what? What is the state? The state is an abstract notion. The state usually comprised of politicians who are usually male, who do the patriarchy. In Afghanistan, it was simply this. The Taliban took over the state. And usually you take over the state when you take over a capital of a state. A state is a fiction we all believe in because we recognize it in a system called the Westphalian system, and then we give it a seat at the United Nations. The state itself can't patriarch. It usually has to be male politicians. And usually in some cases, females who go along with the patriarchy to allow it to occur. What's happening in Afghanistan is patriarchy of the state. But then there's another level of patriarchy, and that's of the culture, cultural actors. And who are cultural actors? Who creates culture? Could be anything from authors, intellectual, TV hosts, professors. To, in this case, we have to realize culture differs around the world. Or in Afghanistan, usually culture and cultural values and cultural norms are communicated via the tribe and tribal leaders. And we have to realize a lot of patriarchy is done by tribal structures. We accept this patriarchal system because it's always been this way amongst our tribe. In Afghanistan, that's the next level, the tribal level, patriarchs in Afghanistan. And I'm going to show you how what's happening in Afghanistan is a product of culture and politics, opposed to just religion. Other levels in which patriarchy emerges, we don't really need to talk about it. Patriarchy is usually communicated and enforced in society through the market. What do you think of advertising? Products that are sold, how women are basically products themselves. Okay. That's patriarchy of the market. And then we also have another level, we could just say it's linguistic patriarchy. The words we use, patriarchy. The words we use do the patriarchy. So really what this lecture is about, what is my argument, is this. My argument is that the Taliban represents patriarchy of the state and culture. And now I have to prove it to you. Opposed to just being a manifestation of a religion. Religion is the justification to hide what is basically a new state and an old cultural tradition of a particular community in Afghanistan. So let's use this in this case. In RBG's legacy, what was her legacy? She was fighting patriarchy of the state. Because with the state in this case, if we're talking about the American state, 3 branches, executive, legislative, and judicial. It was a judicial system that had primarily kept women out that RBG had to fight against. This was a lecture on patriarchy of the state last year. And so is this lecture. So where do we begin? We begin in Afghanistan in 1928, when its king, it was a monarchy, wanted to modernize. And the example they took was from Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. It's hard to imagine. In 1928, what did this king of Afghanistan want to do? Well, he wanted to borrow what was Atatürk's modernization idea. And that was to encourage women to abandon the veil. You have to realize veiling, it might seem like a traditional religious practice. From the 1920s to the 1970s, actually the trend was for women to, you had a decrease in women who wore the veil. Then something happened around the 80s throughout the Muslim world, just like we have kind of a birth of a Christian evangelical movement. The turn to religion also occurred in the Islamic world. If you look at the 1920s, for a nation to be modern, it was focusing on the veil. The veil became a symbol that for our women to become modern, they must abandon the veil. The early feminist movement in the Muslim world also focused on the veil as a symbol. Hey, hola. No pasa nada. Now here's the key. It's this. The veil often became such a symbol that it became just like this. I can't think of any other better analogy. Think how the mask became politicized? So did the veil. I'll just give you an example in the US. It's often said, you can tell if somebody is a Democrat if they wear a mask, or Republican if they don't. But you see, that was the case in Afghanistan, or Turkey, or Iran, all three countries that were modernizing around the same time. You see, a woman who veiled became a billboard for the state, saying, I adopt the modernization that my state is doing. So of course, the greatest example of a billboard of the state, who could be a better billboard than the Queen of Afghanistan at this time? You see the way, what was she doing? She's not just a queen who's dressing for a picture. She is dressing for the entire nation, saying, if you want to be like me, this is what you should look like. Western and unveiled. And so that anyone who dressed in this style was serving as a billboard of the state, okay? Now, of course, you have to realize, she's not just a single woman with agency. Now, of course, on an individual level she is, but she's also a pawn amongst these male politicians, the generals who all had a project saying, this is what it means for our state to be modern. You basically have to look like this. It was really as men had the vision, this is what our modern country should look like. And more or less, they were telling women, this is how you should dress. If we jump to the late 1960s, if you notice the names are familiar, Soraya Tarzi was the queen. Here is now a fashion designer, one of her relatives, many years later in 1969. And again, it's hard to imagine Afghanistan looking like this because you have an image of Afghanistan, right? And it's usually not this, okay? But this is a question. If you look around here or here, didn't Islam as a religion always exist? Wasn't it always there? Wasn't it always being practiced? So you have to see, it's not the existence of a religion in and of itself that forces women to appear in a certain way. We're seeing, in fact, that this has always been a historical phenomenon. And counterintuitive, we say veiling is kind of an old-fashioned, antiquated habit. But what we're trying to prove to you is no, veiling in fact has nothing to do with history. It's a very new phenomenon. And just to show you pictures of what Afghanistan looked like during this period. Because again, first, on one level, I just want to break your image of what Afghanistan was over time by going back in the past. You have even issues of vogue set in Afghanistan. Let's not forget the Afghan jacket, the 1960s. This was the Afghanistan of the 1960s. And if you remember, this was also the era of the hippie trail, where a lot of hippies, of course, were taking the hippie bus from London. They would go through Afghanistan and end up in India. A record store in Kabul in the 1960s. Now, this is women at a medical college. Afghan women studying medicine in the 1960s. Kabul International Airport in 1967. Now, just look at the juxtaposition between this image in 1967 and Kabul's airport, and the images you saw very recently. Yeah, at the same time, you also have to remember, right? And a lot of those images I'm showing you were the elites. There was still another major problem with the modernization. You see, modernization was equated with this, Western dress, this. At the end, there was also another problem, and that was of power. You see, modernization, when you focused on the superficial aspects of a woman's appearance, what got neglected was attention to the rural countryside, girls' education. This was something that was neglected. So in other words, it was more or less kind of an economic issue. But again, so that's what I'm trying to say, you had a dichotomy between the everyday lives of Afghans and a different Afghanistan, the Afghanistan that looked modern, but modern being defined really essentially as Western. And again, here you see the dichotomy. Images that usually you don't associate with Afghanistan, you know, a young Western woman walking like this, but also, if you look at this, it's a divide that has nothing to do with religion, you see, per se. It's about a conservative countryside coming up, crashing against the modernizing culture, really of the capital Kabul. The Taliban was born primarily in a city called Kandahar. And again, it's hard to imagine that at one time there was an Afghan air traveling to cities like Kandahar. It's basically a city established by Alexander the Great. Kandahar is just how the Afghans would pronounce Alexander. Now, something else is going on here now. When we get to this, something has happened that's quite different. And I call this the securitization of Afghan women. When I showed you those pictures, I just want to take you back to the past. I want to take you to a different time. And also would give you the caveat that those pictures also represent a narrow slice of Afghan women. Now something else is happening, and this is what we call securitization. You're using Afghan women to make an argument that really has very little to do with Afghan women themselves, and that is this. This and this represents retrogression, going backwards in time. Basically, it is a critique that to dress like this is to be modern, and this is good, and this is bad. I'm gonna say that's what simply a meme does. Okay. Now, I'm gonna talk about the ethics of this later, because at the end of the day, what am I arguing is, throughout the entire history of Afghanistan, what was deprived to their women was choice. You see, you had one state that told Afghan women, take off the veil to be modern like this. And then you have a new state saying, wear the veil to be like us. And you have no choice in the matter.
But if you were to wear the veil in 1972, they wouldn't kill you or they wouldn't put you in jail.
Oh, sure.
So that's more of a choice than what we're seeing today, right?
I don't think the person who created this meme has this in mind. And because I'll tell you, these usually you find memes like this in kind of Islamophobic circles. With an agenda, you see, that is basically not really caring about the Afghanistan women. It is about making a point that our ways are better. So absolutely, yes, to be allowed on the campus, you couldn't feel like this, right? But at the end of the day, what is getting missed here? You see, in the greater picture, my argument is this. It was never about the choice of an Afghan woman. Because I have to make a point like this. How is this securitization, you might say? Very good point. But when Donald Trump, remember Donald Trump, he was never big into reading. He always had showing names and pictures. So when basically an army general was making the case to Donald Trump saying, we need to invest more forces in Afghanistan. No worries. When a general was making the point to Donald Trump, we need to invest more military forces in Afghanistan. How does he convince Donald Trump? Basically, he says to Donald, look, this is how Afghanistan looked like back then, and we can make this happen if you allow us to send our more troops. Now, of course, why did this appeal to Donald Trump? He's saying, wow, I can make Afghanistan look like this. This is what Afghanistan should look like. Look at these short skirts, you know? Easier for me to grab them by the, you know what? I mean, I'm being crude, but you understand how Trump's talking. That's what I meant by securitization. Now, all of a sudden, so why does the US increase its military force in Afghanistan? Because Trump says this is how Afghan women should look like, not this. You find it again, so this is really a discourse. It's a discourse born out of kind of Islamophobia. This is bad, this is good. Now, an Afghan will look at this, but you see now, an Afghan will look at this picture and just have nostalgia, God, was our country like that? But that's not what's happening in these memes. If I bring them together, what am I saying? Again, this is securitization, you see. Afghanistan and Iran. What makes all of this bad and retrograde, you see? The veil. So that the veil becomes a symbol. This is us, the West. And this is them, the backward Middle East, that the difference has to do with the veil. And again, this is what you're seeing here. Afghanistan then, no. Iran then, no. Now, do you see here, do you see what I'm saying? This is all building up to a point. Really, this is now, it becomes all about the whole Islamophobia debate. And all of this, what are the women? They become proxies. And usually in debates, that really is never concerned about the women of Afghanistan. So if you look at this article, what is it saying? With all those images, what is Alex Shemp's arguing? That this is the weaponization of nostalgia. Afghan miniskirts become the latest salvo in the war on terror. So what is he saying? Women were free is equated with women's freedom with miniskirts. Instead of defining women's freedoms in terms of social, political, and economic rights, like literacy, access to healthcare, and so on, both positions reduce freedom to how your skin is showing or not showing. A photograph becomes all it takes to decide that women are free or not free. Now, what is he writing about? This is when Trump made that decision based on that picture, you see. What is ultimately the problem is about this? It's the following. Number one, it was a small group of the population. And number two,
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was just going to comment.
Yes.
But don't you think that, for example, this movie is just, but maybe some people can use those images to say, not so much that women scared people's freedom, but that women being able to wear skirt if they want to people's freedom, right?
Absolutely. But what if you're a politician who launches an entire war based on that notion? But then just says, okay, we've had enough and give up, right? Do you see there is not one ethical issue? And again, it comes down to women having choice. Any Afghan will look at this nostalgia. But you see, it's always different in the mind of the actor, the mind of the viewer. But what I'm also arguing here, it's never been, you're absolutely right about this, but all of this, when it's used to justify war, then there's something problematic, it becomes secure.
Yeah, I'm not telling her we're going to Chinese food. I'm just telling her I have an appointment tomorrow.
Like even
And what is this by 8:15? Like treating
no,
things?
like even today,
I think that's Iman.
I kept saying Rashi, do you
Oh,
want
it's
to go
Rashi.
to Google Map? And she was like, no.
Rashi.
I was like, you have to get ready. Just
Exactly. I was waiting. I was waiting for her and मैं कब जाएगी तब तैयार हुई क्योंकि सामने तैयार होने से अच्छा नहीं लगता ना
I get awkward and get ready. Like, I like my space when I get ready because like
Do this, okay.
Yeah, my question was like, also, I get like when you use it to, like, as I mean, to justify our words, but also, is it normal that it becomes a symbol, or like, I cannot put in a photo, like, they are not gonna have literacy, or like, they're not gonna have healthcare, but like, when the Taliban came into the power, one of the first things that they did was like, you have to wear this. So it's also normal that it becomes a symbol because they are also using it as a symbol for their power now.
Exactly. So in other words, what happened in this case? For the Taliban, these now become the new billboards of their state at the end of the day. At the end of the day, it was always the patriarchy of the state present here. Let's look at how did the Taliban emerge. And to understand that, you see an ethnic group. See if I can get this one. Does that say Samsung behind you? Is that really a Samsung? Oh, I think so. Should be on. That would make it easier. Person. You guys seen the new camera, we don't have to deal with this. Shouldn't say technology. Yeah. So what's the story of that? Oh yeah, there we go. Theory. Yes, okay, like the old days, very good. Historically, there's an ethnic group known as the Pashtuns. And do you see how they straddle the border of Pakistan and Afghanistan? The Pashtuns, if I could tell you, are primarily inhabitants of a mountain range here. They have their own tribal culture known as Pashtun Bali. And we have to understand it's a very, we could say, conservative tribal culture, tribal honor, where basically, even throughout the history, if we take away religion in this, tribes tend to have very kind of what we could say conservative patriarchal systems of justice. The vendetta is something that comes from the days of tribal honor. One tribe kills one of ours, we have to kill them. And of course, for a tribe's honor, you have to realize, and this goes throughout wherever tribe is a social system, always, not always, depended on the tribe, but tribes in particularly areas where there's, let's say, scarce resources, women were seen as a commodity to be regulated and protected from the other tribe. Because if another tribe steals one of your women in a raid, it reduces the honor of your tribe. It's the story of medieval Arabia. It's the story of the mountains of Pakistan and Afghanistan. Now, do you see how the Pashtun emerged amongst this ethnic group? The Taliban emerged amongst this ethnic group. What is the story? The story is this. This is what happened in the 1980s. In the 1980s, you see here the Soviets invaded, trying to support the communist government of Afghanistan. Now, under the communist government, so how did Afghanistan try to modernize in the 1970s? Some Afghans thought the solution was communism. And of course, the Soviet Union was more than happy to help the Afghan government stop this. Now, think about what are the tenets of communism, right? A de-emphasis on faith. No religion. No religion. So any shows of religiosity in communist Afghanistan now would be forbidden, right? But to see what's happening here was, of course, the communist government of Afghanistan was facing resistance from about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 different, more or less we could say warlords, who had one thing in common. They were opposed to the Soviets and the communist government of Afghanistan. Collectively, they would be known as the Mujahideen. And they both, they established themselves in different parts of Afghanistan. And you see the Soviets could never really control the mountains. They could only control the roads. Which leads to a war that lasts from 1980 to 1989. Where the Soviets realized we cannot control Afghanistan. It's impossible. And they withdraw. Look at the difference here. It took the Soviets 9 years to realize this, opposed to the US, and they're 20 years. With the withdrawal, what happened? Afghanistan, for 9 years of war, created a massive refugee problem. It's created. If you are Pashtun here, so we see the Soviets controlled the roads, the fighters fought from the mountains. Most of the refugees found refuge amongst their fellow Pashtuns in Pakistan. Now, what happens amongst these refugees? Think 9 years, that's a whole generation. If you're a child when the Soviets invaded, right? You're about an adult by the time the Soviets withdrew. Where would you get your education? In the refugee camps here, not from the UN. Mostly they would be scholars, or I should not even say scholars, charities. Charities funded by a country that's becoming very wealthy in the 1980s, flush with oil dollars. Saudi Arabia. Most of the kids in those refugee camps got an education, not in an Islamic education, but the Saudi version of Islam. No, and of course, just the word for a student in Persian and Arabic is talib. Add an an, you've made it plural. The Taliban just simply means the students. And this should raise a question again, not dealing just with women, but also another vulnerable population from a human security perspective. Another population that's vulnerable in war is children. The same thing happened in Somalia. Somalia also has now a massive militia that controls large parts of the country. It's known as Al-Shabaab, which is also works with Al-Qaeda. Al-Shabaab simply means the youth. And you see something similar going on. Displaced youth in refugee camps, what do? When the UN or the international community doesn't focus on their education or faith, they take aid from wherever they can get it. What did the Taliban do? Why did they form? Once the Soviets withdrew, these 7 groups started to fight with each other. And basically, what did the Taliban do? Simply to end the fighting between these groups. And for that reason, in the 1990s, many welcomed the Taliban. Now, one of my main arguments was, what was the mistake in this case? The US gave a lot of aid to these groups to fight the Soviets. The minute the Soviets withdrew, all American attention on Afghanistan also left. For a minimal amount of the cost to support these groups to fight the Soviets, had just some investment been made in reconstruction, resettlement of the refugees, and stabilizing the country. This is a question. Getting these groups to work in a power sharing agreement instead of fighting amongst themselves. Would the Taliban have emerged in the first place? There was a window of time right around the 1990s, and think what was happening in the world in the 1990s. The US was concerned about Iraq and Kuwait and all the oil that entailed. That the US basically completely forgot about Afghanistan. And the failure to invest in its reconstruction. To think about how much it would have cost to invest in Afghanistan in this reconstruction in the early 1990s and the project it did of trying to rebuild an entire nation. That's the story of how the Taliban emerged.
Well, didn't it also have something to do with the US that also all the weapons there, so that they were highly armed as well?
Yes.
Then when the Soviets withdrew, they also had like Soviet military gadgets.
Exactly, all these different groups. Not only the Soviet weaponry, the advanced US weaponry, the Stingers, and now they're turning them against each other. And this is why the Taliban were welcomed in the beginning. After the Taliban are overthrown in 2001, what happens? Who does the US depend on now to form the new government? The same old warlords. And what did the same old warlords do after 2001? They started fighting each other. And again, now let's jump back to 2021. And then we're saying, why did a good number of Afghans welcome the Taliban? Again, was just to bring security. Yes? Oh, okay.
I've got a question.
Yes.
Did the US partner with a specific tribe to be able to establish a government? Or did they find some sort of like power sharing agreement to form the government of a?
So the idea is these groups here, the Pashtuns, are the majority. The whole idea is we would put a Pashtun in power, but hopefully they would work with all these different ethnicities. And it didn't happen. No, these problems didn't go away. But the thing is to also keep in mind that a lot of what the Taliban imposes on women has a lot to do with patriarchal culture, particularly the culture of the Pashtun, of the mountainous Pashtuns who are tribal in nature. Now, keep in mind, of course, not all Pashtuns are organized in tribes. Every single one of those people I showed you in the pictures were Pashtuns themselves, the kings, so on and so forth. We're talking about a very tribal, mountainous, conservative Pashtun culture. That's what the Taliban represents. Why did the Taliban emerge? Number one, Saudi education as a result of displacement, and already a pre-existing, very conservative tribal culture came together And that's how the disaster that that we know as the Taliban, that's how it emerged. This is the latest picture we had out of Kabul. Do you see what's happening here now? This is quite symbolic. Remember, I kept on talking about women as billboards. In this case, do you see what did the Taliban do? They cannot have this image there. This image represents a threat to the Taliban, you see. Now, I want to show you another group who used to do this. This is the Islamic State. Even hair products for women. Do you see how the woman's face has to be obliterated? The woman, do you see what's happening here? What does the face represent for these very patriarchal organizations? Obliterate their eyes, obliterate their mouth, obliterate the face, really obliterate their agency. We obliterate their individuality. That this is somehow a threat to us. This becomes another securitization of women now. This represents security for them. So you see something that the Taliban has in common with the Islamic State. If we look at the capital, this is the equivalent of Kabul for the Islamic State. What do I say is in modern states, here's literally a billboard of the state telling women how she dress. Now, what am I saying then? When a woman dresses like this and walks like this, she becomes a billboard of the Islamic State. Basically, what is she saying? Whether it's a woman in the Islamic State or in Afghanistan, this is all about male power. You see, the fact that we're forced to dress like this means we do this because there are men who have the power to make us dress like this, who can take away our choice. In other words, I'm trying to make an argument. This isn't about religion. The religion is not patriarchy. It's the state. What am I calling these women? Billboards of the state. Here we literally see the billboard. And what is the role of these women? To rock around, to announce to the world, the minute a woman leaves the house, this is the power of the state. It can force us and dictate how we appear in public. Now, if we talk about this as patriarchy of the state, this is a state dictating a woman its power, saying we are so powerful. A woman, the minute she leaves her home, has to dress the way we say she dresses. Like I said, what is the state? Is a group of male politicians. Do we see a similar dynamic when a group of male politicians say, look how powerful the state is? We can dictate what happens in a woman's uterus. It's all about the state trying to communicate how far our power can reach. I'm saying this is all about power.
What would you say to the people that, for example, in Europe, dress with a burqa because they choose to do so?
It's a different matter entirely. If and only if though, this is the question. Are we entirely sure that woman isn't pressured to? It becomes entirely tricky. There are some women who wear the burqa.
And it's submission to the man, not to the state.
It's a different level of patriarchy. You see, it's a different level. I'm trying to argue Afghanistan. That's an entirely different issue. Now, I could make an entirely different argument that even veiling is not an Islamic tradition. It's an old Mediterranean tradition that predates Islam, Christianity, even predates Judaism. It's really an ancient Mediterranean tradition. That's what I in my old patriarchy thought. I even argued this isn't really even associated with Islam. It was an old way of, since time immemorial, from the ancient Greeks, men controlling the way their women appeared in public. It was a way of saying that these are our women, opposed to what? In ancient Greece, and just remember when Alexander conquered, ancient Greek tradition spread throughout the entire Middle East. In these areas, who did not veil? Prostitutes. You see, veiling was a way to distinguish who was the property of a man and who was not a property of a man. And that was basically the only two categories women could fall in, girl and women. So that's an important statement. In that case, the board president in Europe is a different issue, different levels of patriarchy, but then also just to realize that the veil itself is a form of patriarchy that even precedes the emergence of all three of these religions. Now, with the case of the Islamic State, you see what's symbolic here. Here is a woman who fought in a militia that helped defeat the Islamic State. What is she doing in this case? Do you see what she's trying to destroy? She's trying to destroy the literal billboard of the state, but the system that would otherwise normally force her to dress like this had she been in territory conquered by the Islamic State. This is the struggle, you see. She's not fighting Islam per se, the Islamic State, she's fighting a system usually created by men.
Why is it so extreme though? Why is the face so covered?
Okay, so why is the face so covered? We have to go so far back in time to the ancient Assyrians, to the ancient Babylonians. Now, this is the question we have to ask. We have to ask them, why did he make it so extreme? And of course, we know they won't give us the answer. We know veiling was conducted that far back in time because of archaeology. So when a group of new women started to adhere to a religion called Christianity, we have ancient Christian images of women, Christian women, with their face entirely covered. Although even wearing gloves in a desert environment. So why is it so extreme the entire face is covered? It's probably a combination of factors. This was probably something that was worn in desert environments, where you cover your face to keep the sand out. And then later assumed religious significance. That's probably its origins, but it's so far back in time, we don't know. All we know is that this entire face veil has had a long history. And basically, I think it's a matter of this. It's the most conservative societies in the Islamic world, particularly Saudi Arabia, where this is born. But also you have to remember the Gulf societies are also very traditional Arab tribal culture. And basically, I think for them it's a matter of power. Look how much power we have over women, that only their eyes are shown. That's my hypothesis.
I think it's also essentially male jealousy that they.
Yes, male jealousy. This is I will not allow any other eyes to fall upon my women.
We hold some kind of assumption that men can't hold themselves against like raping women that they find attracted to.
It's an assumption. This is an assumption with awful consequences. What is known as the burqa, you see though, it's not worn in the rest of the Islamic world. It has a specific location again, where I can make an argument that this is cultural. It's usually worn amongst Pashtun women. Okay. So, in this particular case, there was active agents. In this case, women who took agencies to fight against the Islamic State. Now, when we talk about the future, unfortunately, I don't see that happening in Afghanistan. I don't see an organized movement that could fight the Taliban. And remember, this woman could only do this was because the US was giving her air support to defeat the Islamic State. In this particular case, not only the US, but most of the world just seemed to give up on Afghanistan and let the Taliban be. That's why I don't see this in the future. And it's kind of, I just realized something tragic when I opened up my USB drive. And I saw these just various talks I've given. The patriarchy talk back last year, a whole entire talk on sexual violence, and here I am now in Afghanistan, where now I kind of realize something that's tragic. When I talk about the future of Afghanistan and for the women there, I'm talking about they have no future. This is basically what the Taliban are saying. And it works like this. You see, the Taliban ruled Afghanistan. Oops. The Taliban ruled Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001. The women were going through these horrific conditions. It's okay, we don't need it. The women were going through these conditions. They were forced to wear the burqa. They were denied education. And really, the international communities didn't care. It was only in 2001, with the events of September 11th, 20 years ago, then all of a sudden women's rights were an issue. But the women's rights were all kind of, I would say, a smokescreen to justify what was part of the invasion of Afghanistan. And here we are now in 2021. And now the US is withdrawn. And all of a sudden, the women's rights that were so crucial for the US to go into Afghanistan no longer becomes an issue now. That's why I'm saying this is all about securitization. It's all about politically. Women's rights are only important when usually there is some kind of greater geopolitical interest of a state going into Afghanistan, or any state for that matter, but Afghanistan, of course, is the case we're studying. So then now if I conclude, and it's a tragic conclusion, it's the conclusion I made to end the RBG talk. And it's this. Why is it important to use patriarchy as a verb? It's the following, because now we realize this isn't about the Taliban, this is about power. And the thing is, whether we're talking about the Taliban or all patriarchal structure is, it's not just this. What am I saying here? The Taliban is an outcome of patriarchy. But look what happened. Remember, this is the present in Afghanistan. It's going to be the future, but also remember, it was the past in 1996 and 2001. We let the past become the present and the future of Afghan women. We allowed it to happen. Now, of course, this raises a bunch of issues. Should the US then go in? Should there be another war? I'm saying no, none of that. All I'm saying was that in the 1990s, there was a window of opportunity to help Afghanistan rebuild, and it was ignored. And because the nations of the world always ignore humanitarian concerns, this is how we got this problem. That's the only thing I'm saying. But I am saying this. Patriarchy is a system of power. Whether it's the Taliban or the US government in the case of RBG. And it's a system that affected every single woman in front of it. You see, patriarchy, I just realized when we use it as a verb, it's a form of power that dominates time. And the way to think of it is just to make my argument for the women in this class. Who has patriarched you in the past? Who is patriarching you in the present? Who would you anticipate patriarching you in the future? You probably have a dream job. You're probably wondering, is there some man in my way who will get in the way of it? Or help me achieving this? If I can answer these questions, and I think all of you have an answer to this, then you've proved my argument that patriarchy, whether it's in Afghanistan or in this room, is a system of power that knows no boundary and knows no temporal limits. On that sad note, that's where I conclude. All right, the time we have left, what conclusions or observations do you want to make? Also for you Zoomers. Anything you want to ask?
I have some questions.
Yes.
So regarding this, like, okay, like for example, you compare this game and you said that it is sometimes there is like this paternalistic and white gaze opinion.
Yes, very good. Good.
But the thing is that at the end, like this presentation, maybe I get it wrong, but I noticed that maybe like we said that the burqa is more oppressive than the niqab, and the niqab is more oppressive than the hijab. And I think that we cannot like generalize and make, I don't know, like I think that the oppression is given in Western countries and it's not like a generalization on clothes maybe. And that was like my
So that's good. We focus too much on the clothes.
yes.
And we forget other issues.
And at the end that's like you're giving like is more freedom. And that's like my question is it's like really hard to me sometimes to get it because like everyone gives you like their opinion based on their identity. And it's really difficult to maybe I'm getting this from an Islamophobic point of view, maybe this like super radical. And that's like my difficulty with this much, I guess.
So yes. And basically, no. I mean, my argument comes down to this: is that throughout the history, a woman's ability to choose her own fate has always been forgotten, and it gets forgotten in these debates right now. Okay, this has never been. So, in other words, the biggest debate in the Middle East is veiling sanctioned by Islam or not? We have a huge debate about this. My answer is, regardless of not, if you believe it's what Islam sanctions, and Islam you have the choice to wear the hijab, that's good. But it's rarely that issue. It's a matter of a choice. The hijab, I was just talking to an Iraqi student, who said, basically her choice of wearing the hijab was her father's time. It's usually implemented by different levels of patriarchy. In Yemen, there is no state, yet everyone veils. Because there it's cultural. A woman who doesn't wear a veil is called a whore. There's no state, the state's collapsed, but yet every woman wears the veil. You see, it's just all I ask you to do is appreciate the different level. And usually just to realize it's not religion in and of itself.
Like, for example, we were talking about the veil being a symbolism and in the memes, but for example, why do you choose like this image to be, for example, like the cover of like the top?
I didn't choose the image, but I like it so much. No, but I like it because it's, I mean, they also chose this very good one. Yeah, because, right? It's my whole argument is this isn't about religiosity, this is about the billboard of the state and power. So even I would choose it just to make the argument that this isn't about an Islamic way of dressing. It is about a particular group of men who want to hold power. This is the way they control women and kind of advertise their power. That we have the ability to dictate how women appear on the street.
There's an online question.
Sorry?
Somebody
Oh,
online.
sorry, yes, please.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna go. I had a question because you said there's basically no future, or at least the future of these women in Afghanistan is the past. But don't you think that it is somehow inevitable that women, or at least in these societies, that you have more equality because women are just so important for any economic developments, right? I mean, isn't demography, the increase of the demographics in a country the best predictors of economic growth, or just the fact that it would make an economy more participative and you know, these countries could enjoy, you know, be more developed and have access to more technology. And it has also been the story in Europe, right? I mean, we are not living under Babylonian rules anymore in a way, or under ancient Rome. So could there be a future more bright
No,
in
I
the
mean,
past?
Saudi Arabia, if we look at Saudi Arabia since its creation in the 1930s, this is an entire economy that's never allowed women to work. But it gets fine, it does fine. As long as you have a group of men who says our religion, this is the key, our interpretation of the religion is more important than economics, then this system persists. This system persists, unfortunately. Khadija.
What's the European response to Afghani refugees?
Okay, now there's the other issue, because like I said, if this was really about concerns of the Afghans under the Taliban, then shouldn't we also be equally concerned about the refugees, right? And that's a question. We're concerned about the Afghans of the Taliban, but as long as they stay there. The minute they want to try to come to our country, it's a different matter. Well, the response has been, again, now the security, so I say women in Afghanistan have security, so have the refugees. When I say securitization, it is where the left and right in every country now uses the Afghan refugee as a way to advance their own agenda, so to speak. On the border between Poland and Belarus, you see, what is happening? Belarus is securitizing Afghan refugees as a way of retaliating against the EU. Poland, which already had its experience with the Syrian refugees, is already securitizing those refugees. We don't know what those refugees are. They're Muslim. They could undermine our Catholic culture. Again, they become securitized. Securitization is more or less the opposite of humanitarian ethos. Humanitarian ethos is basically the whole issue of human security says we're all humans at the end of the day. Their security should be guaranteed. Securitization, on the other hand, says we have to take these people, use them as an object, and see what does it mean for the security of my group, my nation, my gender, my race. So that's been the European response. This is the refugees will also be securitized. And the first waves haven't really emerged yet. We're still waiting. And I know this because literally I'm talking to 2 students right now who are stuck in Kabul. The minute the domestic flights are going to emerge, they're going to fly into Mazar-e-Sharif. They're going to probably go into Uzbekistan, make their way to Turkey. And that's when the waves are going to begin. And that's when it's going to begin. Yeah. So we have to wait and see, but it's probably gonna be the repeat of the 2015 Syria. Yes.
What are the possibilities, the current possibilities for women in Afghanistan? Like what education is approachable and
Well, we don't know, but we doubt they're gonna get any education. We doubt they're gonna get it.
Like, yeah, I heard that women with degrees have to like hide them and burn them, otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, so exactly this, and flee, and are under threat. And it's not just education, it's a woman's ability to communicate via art, that's never gonna be able to happen again. To communicate in the public space. That's what I say, that's patriarchy. When a woman has to think in the future, she is being patriarchal. Saying this I can no longer do as a form of power. We'll work our way down. Yes.
Yes, I wanted to ask, do you think there's a way moving forward that the idea of modernization can ever be separated from the idea of becoming more Western? Because it's not just something we see, for example, in Afghanistan, but also
Sorry, the sirens,
That's okay.
can you say it again?
Do you think, like, moving forward, there's ever a way that modernization can be detached from the idea of just becoming more Western? Because that's not just a problem.
That is it's a profound question. It's really the whole field of post-colonial studies. Ask this. It's an entire discipline. And it's to answer your question, it appears not at this point. Based on what we're seeing after the fall of Kabul, it appears not. Yeah.
Then it's always like you're balancing a dangerous
Modernization
line.
equals Westernization. Yeah. Yeah.
My question was that aren't the Taliban now letting them go to study to university and all that, but like dividing them between men and women?
Well, see, that's what Iran does, which is another patriarchal of the state society. And if you want to talk about another state that does, that's what Iran is. Is Afghanistan doing that?
Yeah, they said yes. But my question is like, do you think that would endure in time? Because what are you letting them get in education? Because that's gonna let them have a future. So
Yeah. Well, does that really actually mean that? No, I have to say, in Iran, you do have a lot more women in the workforce. I mean, if you compare it to Saudi Arabia, but in Afghanistan, we know you might be doing it for cosmetic reasons, and I'll tell you this: so the Taliban keeps on receiving their international aid.
they're gonna receive international aid.
Humanitarian aid, they're depending on it. Otherwise, the state wants to.
Isn't this one of the cases where like humanitarian aid instead of helping is actually making the crisis worse?
It's probably going to do that.
It's like obviously some people are gonna be like how do you say, damaged by not getting that aid, but at the same time like you're helping the Taliban.
But yeah, exactly. And that's what the world is, the Faustian bargain that the international community is now going to end. This is what we're debating.
They've halted the development aid, but not aid.
Yeah.
They've actually doubled it.
And if you've all taken courses in how this works, it's usually the Taliban will benefit from giving up. And they're hoping on it, they're depending on it. They have no other road. Maria?
Yeah, we've been talking how the hijab is basically like a symbol, but it's not so important. But I would argue that in this case, it is like quintessential. It's super.
Oh, it's overdetermined.
It's a super powerful symbol to actually determine and to include everything, all the prohibition that it comes after the imposition of the hijab in the society, no?
No, I'm not saying the symbol. It's it consumes the debate on really the condition of women in the Muslim world.
Exactly.
It becomes the only mark. If they're not wearing the hijab, they're good, they're free, they're Western, and that's good, and that's what we want. And if they're wearing it, they must be oppressed.
But don't you
It's
think
so
they're somewhat correlated?
No, I don't. I see. Because no, it masks much other issues. Because again, you can have societies. Tunisia, the rate of wearing the veil is quite low.
Yeah.
But would you say women have equal access to education, to jobs? You say in Tunisia.
Yeah.
Would you say that's an exception though?
Yes.
Yeah, so yeah, I forgot when I was asking, I was like, oh shit. Question like Egypt. Or Morocco.
Like there's many women who choose to wear the hijab and many women that choose not to. And but the problem with the rights of women in Morocco has very little to do with whether they are or not using the hijab.
But whether it is an imposition by the state or by the male guardian or the male responsible for the women, do you think that there is somewhat of a connection?
Well, usually, yeah, because those households tend to be conservative and poor in a lot of cases, in a good number of cases. But I still think, no, that's hard to prove. That there's a correlation between socioeconomic development and
And yet it is the symbol that we've chosen.
It's the symbol we've chosen, but that's the thing, it's a huge problem in the Middle East, regardless of how wide the prevalence of veiling is. I think patriarchy exists in all throughout the Islamic world due to conservative cultural values.
And with it comes the hijab.
Not necessarily, not all the time. No, you can still have hijab reigns Turkey, very secular country for most of its history, even banned wearing the veil, which makes people also hide the fact that there's still a lot of problems with domestic violence, women's access to education, so on and so forth.
That's also why I think it's so apparent, because it's something that you really see visually, and that's the reason why.
It's a visual marker, it's just like our masks, right? It just becomes such a visual marker that connotates meaning. And I think, yeah, that's what's misleading.
Because you can talk about this patriarchy, you know, at home or what it does, but they are just actions, but this is something visually.
Exactly, there are abstract actions.
And in this case, it's physical obstruction for women to actually be veiled in this sense.
So let me tell you, in the 1990s, when I was one of the few people really concerned about the Taliban, and I was getting into an argument with a group of Afghan men in the US who said this is a good thing. I was basically saying, since this has been imposed, do you know how many women have been killed in just crossing the street? And basically, what did the men say? Okay, let them die until the women get used to it. That's what I'm saying. It is a physical obstruction. It is. Let them die until they get used to it. I mean, that's how much. What's your name?
Marina.
Marina.
I'm sorry, I keep going back to the idea of choice
Sure, okay.
and the comparison between women in the 60s in Afghanistan and today. And don't you think that women in the 60s wearing a miniskirt was a trend?
It was a trend, yeah.
Yeah, so trends are a form of keeping choice away from them? No, know what I mean? Like, I feel like, because I think you were making the argument that both of them were not able to make a choice, no?
No. I was making the argument that both of, first of all, with the miniskirt, it's a symbol that became securitized. I'm just using that particular case with the Trump administration. I'm not equating them.
Okay.
But I'm just saying behind them, what you have to see are these invisible systems. And I think that's what patriarchy is, where usually men say, this is good and this is bad. And I think around that time with the miniskirts, here you had individual women deciding how to dress, that's fine. But I think at the end, you also had a group of men saying, this is good because it represents how our country should be. And definitely in the 1960s in Afghanistan and Iran, they were making it political. Like, look at our women, look how they dress, this is the way we want our country to be.
Exactly like abortions in the US.
So that's, I think, the argument.
Okay, thank you.
Because that's what I'm saying, so patriarchy ultimately is about systems of reality. And this is like, a group of men saying, this is the reality we want. By the way, what time do we have to leave?
I don't know.
Okay, let's keep it going.
Really quick though, I'm going to pass this list around. If you came in a little bit later, didn't sign in, please sign in now. So I'll just.
Okay, so we'll just say that behind these new trends and fashions during the 60s, there was patriarchy too, right? But if they are seeking to promote a system where women are liberalized and where they can have an option to lead, that maybe it starts as patriarchies, but it is like a seed to something different, right?
Sure. In Turkey, for example, if you wore the veil, you weren't allowed into the university, or into the post office, or to run for political office. So that's what I'm saying. This because remember Afghanistan, Iran, they were all copying the Turkish model. So again, isn't that denying a woman's choice?
But wouldn't you argue that the freedom that women in this case enjoy in Afghanistan and Turkey is very different? Even when both of them are oppressed, not to the same extent.
Sure. So it is, but then at the end of the day, isn't it the ethos? Because I think that extreme to say at the end of the day, still isn't it a group of men running a state dictating how a woman should dress? I'm trying to kind of put myself empathetically, if I was a veiled woman in Turkey and said, this is, I believe, how my religion. No, so remember what I'm saying. I believe that the veil is not an Islamic symbol. But let's just say I am a Turkish woman. I believe the veil is an Islamic symbol based on my interpretation of the Quran. I want to go to university to study engineering. I cannot because the state doesn't let me. And because most engineering students are men anyway, I'm never going to succeed in this field. That's all I'm saying. We have to realize patriarchy existed in the setting.
If we take the example of France, like women mothers on field trips cannot wear the hijab because it's a bad example for the students, right? Isn't that also a patriarchal choice? Because like for example, like my grandmother wears the hijab, but she says because I think I'm gonna go to heaven if I wear it. Like her husband doesn't make her anything. So isn't making women not allowed to wear the hijab just made not as bad, but bad?
No, it's not as bad, but at the end of the day, that's I think the argument I'm trying to make. It is still about the state trying to demonstrate their power, you see. So in this case, the French state wants to demonstrate that it's in our essence that we dictate the way religious attire is exhibited in our public. And if we could dictate that, it's a reflection of this French state's ability to dictate secularism in society. It becomes an element of French power.
Going on the way that we think, like, for example, when we talk about France, they took it as a minor damage, like not giving that freedom to wear the hijab. Like, I mean, maybe they see wars like as a threat that someone, like, because they let that happen, the biggest threat is like they make you cover all of you. So like it's a minor damage that we make women not to cover only their hair. Like, I don't know how to explain, like, maybe like they are actually, like, I think they are actually aware of like, okay, this is kind of an oppression, but we take it as a minor damage towards the future, rather than like more than, like, I don't think it has to do that much with religion, but more like, yeah, maybe, yeah.
So, I mean, this is the ultimate case because, yes, is this religious or is this more of a secular issue that uses religion as a screen? And then at the end of the day, I want to argue that that's what the Taliban is using. It seems it's a group that really says we're doing this in the name of religion, but I think there's another issue. I don't think the Taliban are really concerned about.
Do you don't think like Taliban are really, like, do you think?
No, they believe in it. Okay, this was a huge argument with the Islamic State too. I think they sincerely believe they're doing what is the religion tells them to do. But at the end of the day, there must be some other issue beyond just the religious. That has to do with power and because this is the question I have to ask ourselves. A man can really believe all women should veil. The minute he tries to force every single woman he sees to veil, right? That's what really he wants to control those women. It's not really him saying, this is what I believe my religion says. It's about that man trying to control. And if we multiply that then, I think we understand what's happening in Afghanistan.
Traditional at the beginning, but like, were they this like extreme, for example, or like?
The Taliban?
Yeah.
Were they this extreme?
Like, I mean, like maybe when they got power, they got even more like.
So we got to think about this. Where did were the Taliban were what? A bunch of kids in the 1990s who were just taught in a particular way. And when they came to power in 1996, they became this way, and from 2001, and then again when they came back in power, they were extreme. Well, we got to think of their circumstances. You got to think of an entire decade spent in a refugee camp, going into a country that was in the state of civil war. But then also I have to make another argument. The Taliban were defeated in 2001. All the US had to do was now say, we have to engage with these guys. We defeated them militarily, but we have to give them a role in the process, no matter how abhorrent they are. Maybe that will moderate them. The US refused to do that. And that would also be another strategic mistake. You gave them a reason to fight back. But for the most part, yeah, if there was any kind of attempt to because the thing about any conflict is you have to disengage the fighters and reintegrate them. Any civil war, any conflict. This was an opportunity that was missed.
I think also in connection with this, like rebuilding a state would be for America a cost, while igniting a war or fighting a war actually means economic profit for them. Exactly. The GDP grows, they have special contracts, cost plus percentage of cost, which was also in the Iraq war, like incredible. And I think that's also why they are actually not keen to really initially solve the problem. The whole arms industry, the lobbying that goes behind there, and
Yeah, you don't make profits with peace.
exactly.
Yeah, there is no peace industry. Opposed to the defense industry, which is a multi-billion one, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
How do you think this is gonna affect European culture, for example, like when in terms of, for example, because before this happened with the Taliban, we already had the law in France. So do you think this is gonna be like, this is gonna encourage a wave of like?
Oh, that's too early to say. I'm not sure. I mean, I think already all the fears came with the Syrian refugee crisis and all the fears of how this will affect European culture. But I just imagine those old debates resurfacing. That's about it.
I think in my opinion, it would become more right, more extremist
Yes,
against
when you have, I
Islam.
mean, that, because that was everything that Kabul fell. That was, I mean, everything, if you think in the European discourse was, what does this mean for the refugees in our culture? So just as 2015 led to the election of a lot of far-right groups, definitely those same groups are gonna use now the prospect, just replace Syrians with Afghans, and you give them now more oxygen. So that's, I mean, it's early to tell, but that's probably what's gonna be what's there. Any other questions?
Just a comment, there is a TV show on Netflix that was released this past weekend about 9/11 and the aftermath, invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, and it's super interesting.
Okay, thank you for reminding them and me as well. I will watch that. And then probably I cut up half the lecture, but the next lecture I'll probably give for Afghan girls. It is specifically in the time. Probably there's a new group called Girl Up. Have you heard of them? Yeah, I'll probably will keep your eyes out for that. We'll just focus on. Martha, you know about them?
Yeah, we work closely with them.
Okay, so probably let's do something with them. Just focusing on the girls. There was a part where I paused just to allow a conversation. But yeah. We still haven't talked about the whole issue. I was talking about the past. But the girls represent the future. Yes.
I promise this is the last one.
No.
When it comes to embassies, now that like the Taliban are in power, do you think like they're gonna still let people have their like the countries have their embassies there? There's gonna be like a sign of like, okay, we let the other come.
Well, of course, that's what they want because many embassies, it's like the world has recognized us as the Taliban as now the state of Afghanistan.
And do you think like we're gonna still have our embassies there or like they're gonna?
Well, Spain will basically see what the other NATO countries do.
I mean, not for sure.
But yeah, I mean, if the world has kind of just given up and say the Taliban is the Afghan government, it probably will.
Do you think like taking away our embassies from them will be a sign of like we are still gonna fight against you?
Yeah, but
So the European Union is trying to establish one embassy for the 27.
yeah, that's what it probably is. Like it's the same with what NATO did. All the member countries just fell in line with the NATO. Yeah.
So there is no one ambassador, so sovereignty is not really given or to the Taliban, it's just a multilateral organization.
Okay, very good.
Thank you.
Do you want to make any other announcements about events in the future?
Yeah.
Okay, very good.
Actually, sorry, one more. Our launch event will be in about 2 weeks. We're still confirming the location, but it's going to be a community building event and a cocktail hour. So it's really just going to be a great chance for our members to get to know each other a little bit more and meet people from different degrees and different years. And that's kind of what our club is all about. So definitely keep an eye out for that. If you're not already in the WhatsApp group, let me know and I'll add you to it right now. That's the best way to get information, that and Instagram. So definitely stay connected and we want to see you guys all again. So thank you for coming.